now we're getting into a system where we have wind and solar, which go on and off somewhat unpredictably, and lots of gas. But the gas pipelines that supply us aren't really adequate to handle every situation. We don't really think rationally about these trade-offs. We either try to mandate a policy when the people in charge in government don't necessarily even know the technologies they're talking about that well. They don't really understand the nuances. And we think we can just, mandate renewable energy and it'll bring down prices, it'll have all these good benefits. And then in reality, it turns out to be nowhere near that simple. If the power plants start getting shut off from gas, and there's not enough electricity we can import from other nearby regions, then they have to start shutting down regions. They have to start initiating blackouts. Something similar happened in early 2021 in Texas. A lot of people may remember. They had that terrible cold snap, lasted for, 10 days or so. And they had problems with their natural gas deliveries. They had problems with their wind turbines. The whole system started collapsing. And so they had prolonged blackouts in different parts of the state when the weather was super cold for Texas, like 10 degrees. 250 or so people died in that crisis.
Hello and welcome to New York Insider. I'm Liam O'Neill. I'm sitting down today with Jim Meggs, who is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He writes regularly for their publication, City Journal, and he also has a tech column for Commentary magazine. He's a former editor for Popular Mechanics magazine. Jim, it's really great to have you on New York Insider.
It's great to be here.
You told me that you were that boy who looked up at the sky and dreamed about NASA and flying rockets, and ever since then you've been a techie.
Yeah, I was just one of those kids who was, building model rockets in the basement and reading Popular Mechanics magazine, which later I got to be editor of.
I forgot to mention that. That's very impressive.
And for the Manhattan Institute, I cover technology, environment, a lot of issues that relate to those fields.
Mm-hmm. And you're on the show today because you've written also extensively on environmental policy. Why? Why do you write about that?
Well, in addition to being one of those people who grew up really interested in science, I also grew up really being interested in the outdoors and hiking and biking and mountaineering and all those kinds of things. And I think it's possible to be interested in free market solutions to problems and care about the environment at the same time. So I'm always looking for ways that our environmental policies can be more effective, but sometimes also have a lighter touch in terms of how we regulate an industry or interfere in people's lives, so we can maximize the environmental benefits without restricting people's freedom too much.
Yeah, because in the discussion on environmental regulation, often not far behind is the question of what is the trade-off, right? People are being very aggressive, governments are being very aggressive in some cases, such as New York State, in making environmental policy, but clearly there's going to be a trade-off.
And too often we don't really think rationally about these trade-offs. We either try to mandate a policy when the people in charge in government don't necessarily even know the technologies they're talking about that well. They don't really understand the nuances. And we think we can just, mandate renewable energy and it'll bring down prices, it'll have all these good benefits. And then in reality, it turns out to be nowhere near that simple. It's possible that if there were a different approach, one that wasn't just mandating the technology, but rather rewarding reductions in carbon emissions, say, then you could find an approach that actually gets to the goal faster, but in a way that doesn't disrupt the economy so much.
Would you say sometimes politics really gets in the way?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that's true in a lot of areas.
Most of our lives,
we
right?
still need politics, and we live in a democracy, and I'm certainly not one of those people who's going to be opposed to any kind of environmental regulation. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when the Hudson River was completely polluted. Yeah. It flows right by my house. You could swim in the Hudson today. It really cleaned up the Hudson.
A miraculous story, right?
And acid rain used to be a terrible problem. The mountains upstate were the trees were all dying up in the Adirondacks, and that problem's been really addressed. So I think it's important to recognize progress, and I think it's important to continue striving for more progress, and let's look for the most efficient way to get there.
Acknowledge the need for a certain amount of regulation. I mean, we're filming this right now in a magnificent, miraculous city that is inconceivable 100, 200 years ago. It's largely built on, or dependent on, a certain degree of regulation, right? That 8 million whatever people can live in such close proximity to each other.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I sometimes describe myself as a libertarian, or sometimes I say a squishy libertarian,
Okay.
but we still need stoplights. We still need fire codes. There's a lot of rules that we abide by because they allow us to live together and they allow us to live more safely. And so I'm all for that. But it shouldn't be an endless ratchet where the rules constantly get more and more strict, regardless of the benefits.
So enter climate change into this discussion. Because of the fears surrounding climate change, because of some of the science saying that, well, what does the science say?
Well, so I am one of those people who is, I guess you could say, in the middle on the issue. The science that more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere will make the planet warmer is pretty solid. I know a lot of my readers don't always agree with that, but that science is pretty solid. The questions come up in a couple of areas. First, how bad is it? How much warming has already happened? How much does the warming that's happened influence things like wildfires and tornadoes and hurricanes? And I think the media tends to exaggerate those impacts somewhat. It doesn't mean that those impacts aren't there, but we're going to have hurricanes whether or not we have global warming. They might be a little bit worse with global warming, and we should recognize that. But when the New York Times has headlines that say, that the hurricanes are the product of global warming, that's when I think they're trying to use the news media to manipulate or encourage what they see as the right kinds of attitudes on the part of the public, that we have to do more about global warming. All that said, I am in favor of reducing carbon emissions. The U.S. has actually been on a pretty good path in this regard. Our CO2 emissions have been coming down since about the turn of the century.
Yeah, and why is that?
Well, the biggest reason is we've been replacing coal to make electricity, which is very dirty, with natural gas, which is much cleaner, maybe 60% of the carbon emissions per kilowatt produced compared to coal. So that's
Why did
progress.
that transition take place?
A lot of it's economic. The boom in fracking really brought down the price of natural gas. Here's one example where the market, working on its own, managed to come to a result that's actually very good from an environmental point of view. So natural gas has helped us use less coal to make electricity. So that's positive. You still want to keep going from there. I'm a big advocate for the next generation nuclear power, which
modular nuclear.
Yeah, small
plants.
modular reactors is one type. There's a lot of great research going on. There are dozens of startups now in the last few years devoted to coming up with different types of nuclear reactors that are, in most cases, much smaller. You might gang up several of them in one location. You could install them on the grounds of where you've retired an old dirty coal plant and then have a nice clean modular nuclear plant that could plug into the same power lines.
And the power lines are already there.
Exactly,
right?
exactly. So I think there's a lot of potential here. It's one area where actually Democrats and Republicans are kind of aligned.
Okay.
Under Trump, there were a couple of bills passed supporting more research and support for the next generation of nuclear power. The Biden administration has supported this. So there have been some setbacks, but this is promising. I think if we get the regulations right, we could really see even a continued evolution towards cleaner power. I support wind and solar where they're appropriate. I think sometimes a lot of people think that wind and solar can carry the full load of powering our power grid when they really can't. So that's a challenge. It's particularly a challenge here in New York State. But I do think that more progress is possible than the pessimists think.
Okay. So let's turn to something specific. We spoke before this interview about the closing of Indian Point Power Plant. I think it finally shuttered in 2021.
That's right. Yeah.
That was under the leadership of Cuomo. Why did it close, and what have we learned since its closure?
Yeah, Indian Point is a really sad story from an environmental and an economic point of view, in my view. I've visited the plant twice, once before it closed and once after. The idea of closing down Indian Point was almost like a holy grail for environmentalists in New York State for many years. And through a combination of lawsuits and constant pressure on the owner of the plant, they managed to engineer a situation where the plant owner decided to, voluntarily close the plant. Because they knew that
because of lawsuits.
Because of lawsuits mostly. And they knew they would face all these hurdles. And when Governor Andrew Cuomo made it clear that he would not support the company, the company needed to get the plant recertified for continued operation in the early 2020s.
A New York State certification?
No, from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission.
Oh, okay.
So it's a federal
That's
process. But if the New York State officials are all against it, that's going to make that process a lot harder. And and if everyone's threatening to file a gazillion lawsuits to interfere with that process, if you're the plant owner, it's like, why are we persisting in this very uncertain path? What if we don't get the approvals, right? So they basically were able to kind of intimidate the owner out of continuing down that path. If they had gone through that recertification, that plant would have been good for another 20, another 40 years.
No kidding.
Making clean power.
Because at the time we hear, and even now, you talk to people, oh, good thing it's closed. We were averting a disaster.
Yeah, I understand people thinking that. I mean, nobody wants to live next door to Chernobyl, right? And so one of the headlines from environmental groups was Chernobyl on the Hudson. The fact is, first of all, Chernobyl was a ridiculous, badly designed, badly managed plant. Nothing like that's possible in the U.S. Number one. Number two, the plant itself was, despite the kind of minor issues that any industrial facility is going to have now and then, was, very safe, well run, and
So there was no record of
of anything serious, no. And
serious doom, and there was nothing in the forecast. There was no reason to expect.
Right. And I live not too far from I live not too far from the plant. I would happily live right next door to that plant, but they managed to scare people, and I don't blame the average person. They don't not everybody follows this the way that a reporter covering the industry would. So it's natural for people to be nervous about it, and that's fine. But in fact, that was a lot of scare tactics that were really not justified. So the owner decided to shut down the plant.
When was that?
Well, I think the decision was made in 2017. They allowed it to run for a few more years, but anticipating this shutdown. One of the two reactors shut down in 2020, the other one in 2021. And now the plant is being decommissioned, basically cut up. The parts that can be sold for scrap are being sold off. And so it's this, I think a kind of a sad situation, because that plant produced 11% of the power in New York State, 100% carbon-free, and very, very dependable. It produced 25% of the power in New York City and Westchester County. So a quarter of our power in New York was...
The metro area.
The metro area was this clean, carbon-free. So from a climate point of view, we had a big head start. And what did the environmentalist groups do? They made us go backwards. And at the time, they promised, and I interviewed the head of one of these groups called the Riverkeeper, an environmental group that does a lot of good work in other areas. And it's kind of heartbreaking that their biggest cause was shutting down Indian Point. But he said, we can replace all that power from Indian Point with renewable, wind and solar, and efficiencies. And it turned out that just wasn't true. It was wishful thinking. And Governor Cuomo bought into the wishful thinking. A lot of other people bought into that. But in fact, as was predicted by other experts, as soon as they shut down those reactors, the use of natural gas to make electric power went up. Now, I think we get over 85% of our power in downstate New York is coming from fossil fuels, natural gas, and primarily. And so we've gone backwards in terms of climate. And
so that is pretty ironic.
It's terrible, yeah. And where are the people who champion this as an environmental policy? They've moved on to other things.
The environmental policy hurt the environment.
Yes,
Is
fortunately,
that correct?
yeah, that's exactly right. And so as someone who's leery of too much government interference in markets, I say, if you care about the environment, you have to look really carefully at the policies that are being advocated to make sure they actually work, because they don't always, and sometimes sometimes they backfire, and that's what happened here. Doesn't mean all things advocated as good for the environment are bad, but you need to really look at these things seriously, and there were a lot of incentives, I think, for people not to look at this question seriously, and now we're paying the price: higher emissions, higher electricity costs, and there's one more cost that is kind of invisible to us: the higher risk of
vulnerability.
Vulnerability in our power grid. There's a group called the New York Independent System Operator, NYSO, and their job is making sure that our electricity supply in New York State matches the demand, that we're ready for any kind of big shifts in supply or demand. And they've been warning now for several years that we don't have enough electricity supply. And even as we build more wind and solar, that really isn't adequate, because you can never rely on wind or solar to be workable at any given time. They're going to come on and off as
you always have to have the redundancy
as weather permits. And so, we used to have a power grid that had some hydroelectric. New York has a lot of hydroelectric, so that's good. That's very reliable. A little bit of wind and solar, a lot of coal, a lot of nuclear power, and some gas. So that was a lot of different sources. If there was a crisis in one field, if the coal train stopped running, you'd have these other ways to make power. But now we're getting into a system where we have wind and solar, which go on and off somewhat unpredictably, and lots of gas. But the gas pipelines that supply us aren't really adequate to handle every situation. So if there's a problem with gas supply, then we don't have coal-powered plants we can rely on. We only have a couple of nuclear plants upstate. That are still in operation. So our electricity supply is much less diverse, and that means it's more vulnerable to disruption, especially during periods of extreme weather, either hot or cold.
And we experienced something like this in 2022.
Yeah, I don't know if you got one of these messages, but on Christmas Eve 2021, I got a text alert from Con Edison saying, we're having this cold snap, we're having a cold weather emergency. Please cut down your energy use, both natural gas for heat and electricity, to help us avoid blackouts. And the reason that blackouts are likely in cold weather is you've got natural gas going to power plants, you've also going to houses. When it's really cold, people are burning a lot more gas in their houses, and the system prioritizes energy for the homes. So if the power plants start running out of gas, or they don't have enough to maintain the amount of power, people use more electricity in the cold weather too. They've got space heaters going and everything like that. So if the power plants start getting shut off from gas, and there's not enough electricity we can import from other nearby regions, then they have to start shutting down regions. They have to start initiating blackouts. And this didn't happen in 2021, 22 cold snap, although we got close. But something similar happened in early 2021 in Texas. A lot of people may remember. They had that terrible cold snap, lasted for, 10 days or so. And they had problems with their natural gas deliveries. They had problems with their wind turbines. The whole system started collapsing. And so they had prolonged blackouts in different parts of the state when the weather was super cold for Texas, like 10 degrees. 250 or so people died in that crisis. And due to the fact their power grid just wasn't resilient enough to handle this extra stress.
So a year later, that same scenario could have played out in New York City. We averted it. Had it been a little bit longer, the cold snap, a little bit colder, or a plant just had
or somebody had
some sort of problem.
And in cold weather,
what could have happened?
Equipment breaks. In Texas, they had some of the pumps that they need for the natural gas. They weren't really adequately designed for extreme cold, so some of the pumps went down. So the pipelines started failing. We only have a few pipelines feeding natural gas up to the Northeast. So if just one of those pipelines had a problem, that could have real severe implications. Or maybe a power plant goes down for some other reason, temporarily. So this risk of a blackout is something that the experts are very concerned about. And you might think, oh, a blackout, power goes out for a few hours, like after a storm or something, those short-term blackouts. But this could be much worse. This could be a major blackout that might last for days or conceivably, in the worst case, even weeks. So imagine New York City if it's 10 degrees out.
Yeah, take us through this.
Yeah.
What happens?
Imagine the city, and this isn't a country house, where somebody might have a wood stove or something like that they can fall back on. These are people living in apartment buildings. Imagine if the power goes out for more than 48 hours. Pretty soon everything starts to freeze. Pipes are freezing. Pipes are breaking. Water is cascading down stairwells and freezing. Elevators obviously aren't running. People are stuck in their apartments. How is first responders going to get to a health emergency on the 12th story of an apartment building or a project if the stairwells are full of ice? There's no food in the stores because there's no power, everybody's bought up all the food in the stores. These disaster scenarios.
Just within 48 hours, 8 million people's lives are imperiled.
I would say that it would take a while for the buildings to get that cold, but they would happen, with no heat source, and then you have these other cascading problems. So not to be overly dramatic,
or apocalyptic.
But we live in this very interdependent society, and if one thing goes wrong, then other things can go wrong. When it all works and hums along, it's fantastic, but we are vulnerable. We saw some of this during COVID with some of the supply chain problems. So the electric grid is so crucial for our safety, for our health, for everything in our modern life, and yet we were treated in a very cavalier way. And some of it comes down to this fantasy that we can replace all of our current electricity sources with wind and solar. And I think we're learning as we go along that that's just not feasible.
So with the stroke of, well, I shouldn't say a stroke of a bureaucratic pen. I'm going to go back to an Indian Point power plant because of the scenario that you outlined for us. They shut the plant over a period of 1 or 2 years. And with that, 25% of New York City's metro electricity is now gone. And in the 2 or 3 years after that, where we are today in 2024, it's not been replaced?
That's right. They built a couple of new gas-fired power plants, which took up most of the slack from Indian Point, but we don't have that reserve capacity that we used to have. And so we have enough, on a day-to-day basis, but we don't necessarily have enough in a real emergency.
For the extreme, either really cold or really hot.
Exactly. So this is, I think this is a major concern, and it's a concern to me also that this is the result of a deliberate policy. A policy to phase out certain kinds of energy and rely on the renewable energy, which is almost by definition not reliable. And again, there's certainly a place in the grid for wind and solar. When the sun is shining and the wind is blowing, they can produce nice, cheap energy, but they are not good to be the backbone of the grid precisely because they're constantly turning on and off. Even if the clouds roll over the sun, your solar power production just gets cut dramatically. Then you need to have all these other power plants ready to ramp up in a moment's notice to take up that slack. All of that is a big strain on the power grid. All of that makes the grid less dependable, less resilient. And we're building our nation's environmental policy around this idea, while we're not really doing the math on whether the grid can handle this new way of generating power as its primary source.
And a big player in building our nation's new energy policy is New York State, because in 2019, then Governor Cuomo really pushed through the legislature this enormously complex and very powerful, you could say, New York State Climate Act of 2019. It is still being rolled out. What does that law dictate?
Yeah, well, for one thing, as you suggest, it is sweeping yet vague. The law that was passed in the middle of the night with no debate,
I think it was
no discussion.
11:43 p.m. or something.
Yeah.
Right?
And the details of how it would work were not debated by the legislature or analyzed by independent groups. In fact, what they did was they basically gave a lot of power to the governor's office to basically wing it, to decide where the subsidies should go and how the rules should work, or to make up some of the rules as we go along. And this is still a problem today. As some of the details of this sweeping act are coming into place, it includes a lot of subsidies to offshore wind power, but a lot of those plans are running into trouble because wind power offshore turns out to be a lot more expensive. Jonathan Lesser at the Manhattan Institute did a fantastic study a couple of years ago showing that wind power is just an order of magnitude more expensive. Once you factor in all of the different elements, then it's often presented as being. And yet, New York made wind power one of its main goals in terms of producing power.
I heard 30%, a New York official say.
Yeah, I don't remember that number exactly, but that sounds about right. New Jersey also was attempting to make wind power one of its primary power sources, and it's turning out to be just much more difficult. And some of the companies that were supposed to be building these big wind farms off in the deep water off our coast, they're pulling out. They can't afford to do it. Inflation and supply chain problems are making it not so feasible. So now what? What's our plan B? Yeah. And so this act is going to really have a big impact on people's lives. It also mandates or promises to mandate a lot of different things about how we build houses, how we live in our houses. It mandates that new construction not include, phased in, but eventually that new construction, new buildings in New York should not include fossil fuel energy sources. That means no gas-fired furnace in your basin. It means no gas stove eventually. So they want to mandate that. They want to mandate, another rule mandates that at a certain point, if you need to replace your gas-fired or oil-fired furnace, you need to replace it with electric heat, some kind of heat pump. Now, heat pumps are great. They're very efficient. For those who don't know, a heat pump is kind of like an air conditioner that can work both ways. It can pump heat into pump cool air into your house, or it can pump heat into your house. And if I was building a new house, I would certainly consider that as an energy source. But they want to force people, when the time comes to replace an aging boiler, that you don't have a choice. You'll have to replace it with a heat pump. That doesn't work.
All of the piping and everything.
Yeah. I mean,
easier said than done.
Easier said than done. I mean, I have a house that was all plumbed for radiators throughout the house. That would all have to get ripped out. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. It can cost as much as $40,000 for a house to do all this. And again, for a lot of people, that might be great. A lot of people choose to do this, and that's fine. But mandating it is a different thing. And so there's a lot of coercion in this rule, as opposed to simply streamlining the processes or tweaking the regulations to make these things easier. So, and then New York City is also trying to do its own version of the state's Climate Act with something called Local Law 97.
And excuse me, that's how it's kind of designed, right? I mean, 2019, the sweeping New York State law went into effect. Very sweeping, very vague.
Yeah.
And it's incumbent upon certainly New York City, but also the DEC and DOH and whoever else, all these other state agencies to come up with those details.
Correct. Yeah. Right? So New York City's attempt to do it, predictably, knowing the New York City Council is particularly extreme and particularly impractical. So this Local Law 97 is basically mandating that anybody who owns an apartment building, I believe it's bigger than 25,000 square feet. So that's not, that's a multi-unit, but not apartment building, and bigger. About 50,000 buildings in New York, they all have to start upgrading their heating systems to emit less CO2 starting this year in 2024. Or pay big fines. Okay. The first step of it goes in stages. The first step is not that onerous. 90% or so of current buildings probably comply to this rule. Okay. But then in 2030, a much more strict stage of this law comes into effect. And at that point, a lot of buildings will have to rip out their current system altogether and try to rewire their buildings or replumb their buildings to run on heat pumps entirely. And they are just not, I mean, that's not that many years from now. And there aren't that many companies that install these heat pumps to redo 50,000 buildings if that's what it takes. So this is the kind of thing that I'm sure sounded good for the members of the city council, that we would be on the forefront in the world of going to a zero carbon energy system. And in a perfect world, it would be great. You know, if you were building a city from scratch, you might want to do it this way. But the idea that you can just mandate this and force every landlord and every tenant to take on these costs in a very short time frame, that's the impractical part of it, of creating the situation where people's backs are against the wall.
What do you think people will do?
Well, people are already protesting. They've the Department of Buildings has instituted a kind of an exception. You can apply for some kind of a waiver saying it's too difficult, or you've tried, or you need more time. Those waivers will kick in next year. It's unclear how that'll be assessed. You know, if you were the building, the co-op or whatever that spent, you know, $500,000 upgrading your heating system, and then you find out your neighbor next door just didn't do a thing and just applied for a waiver, you know, I would be pretty annoyed about that. We don't know how it's going to work. Nobody knows. There's so much uncertainty in these things. I bet there'll be a lot of work for a lot of lawyers, you know, petitioning the building department for their landlord clients, and so it's
owning a building, safe to say, has gotten a lot more difficult in New York.
Yeah, and it's never been easy in New York.
It's never been easy.
New York hates landlords, even though they're the ones who are actually supplying the housing that we so desperately need.
Well, yeah, I mean, I just think, you know, I see a lot of headlines about how we have a housing crisis.
Yes.
We need people. We have a housing crisis.
There's
need
no
more
question
housing.
we have a housing crisis. If you try to buy a house today, you know, not just not just the mortgage rates, but just the supply of housing is not keeping up with demand, and yet we're doing everything we can to make it harder to build new housing. And so I think that's a real problem. All these requirements that, again, individually they sound good, you know, energy efficiency, all these things. I love all that stuff. And I think people who are building buildings should definitely be looking at the good new technologies. But trying to mandate all of this from the state government, or from the federal government for that matter, is driving up the cost of housing. It's driving up the cost of compliance. You know, who's going to come around and inspect it? Or if your insulation is 7 3/4 inches instead of 8 inches, are you going to get a big fine? Things like that. It's it's one of these areas where maybe the best is the enemy of the good, and the good is we really, really need more housing. We need to make sure our aging housing is livable, but we also need to make sure that we're building new housing. And these rules really get in the way of that.
Interesting. The best is an enemy of the good. There
Yeah.
are more incremental things we could do, ultimately having maybe a better net effect than shooting for that best.
If you insist on perfection, you know, like every building's going to run on heat pumps, then you might, you know, wind up breaking the system instead of a more gradual but very real progress and improvement.
Do you have recommendations for the common man, common woman on the street, and do you have recommendations for our policymakers?
Yeah, well, for regular people, if you're a homeowner, I do think people should be concerned about the grid reliability, especially if you have older people in your household, health issues, that, you know, where you really rely on electricity. I have not done this myself, but if you can afford it, you should really consider a backup generator for your house, or if you're in the country and you can. And you have room for a little wood stove. Wood stoves cause a lot of local air pollution, but the new ones are a lot cleaner and could make sense. I mean, it's kind of like going back in time. It seems silly that we have to do this, but certainly I have a lot of friends in Vermont and New Hampshire, and none of them would imagine trying to get through the winter without a wood stove, just in case there's a blackout. And then more broadly, there are good things people could do for energy efficiency, like there's a state subsidy that helps subsidize people getting heat pumps. So if you want to pursue that, that option is there. I don't think people should be forced to do it, but it's a good option for some. And then on the policy maker level, I feel like we should always be looking for ways that we can reward markets for solving these problems instead of trying to mandate the solution. So on the federal level, I'm a big advocate for changing the way we regulate nuclear power. Everybody wants nuclear power plants, including these new ones, to be hyper safe, and they are. But the way they're regulated, really over-regulated, really drives up costs and makes it harder to roll out these new plants. We also have a lot of regulations that make it very, very difficult to get the permits to build new energy infrastructure, to build the power lines. So, and New York State is especially bad in that regard. So it's very difficult to, people make all these promises about all this new wind and solar power that's coming along, but then if you can't get that power to where it's needed, it's not very effective. So I would always argue that lawmakers look for market solutions where you first take away the impediments. Before you try to force people to do something, take away the impediments for people doing the good things that they would probably be doing otherwise in terms of upgrading energy for cleaner energy sources.
People within the market who are within those industries can
That's
come up
right,
with
right. I mean, nobody in the power industry wants to be running coal-fired power plants anymore. So so when they're ready to retire those plants, that's fine. I don't think they should be forced to, but I do think that we've been making progress in the right direction for a long time.
Yeah, at the beginning of our conversation, you said since the turn of the century, we've been going.
And ironically, the biggest benefit is another thing that the environmentalists tried to stop, which is fracking. And fracking is actually, because it produces more clean natural gas, which burns and emits less carbon when it burns than coal, fracking has actually helped us bring down our emissions. Now, that's just a start. Ultimately, we want to move on, but it certainly has helped us make a lot of progress. So let's look for more opportunities like that, where maybe you're not jumping all the way to perfection, but you're making steady progress.
Jim, this has been a great conversation. Where can people follow you and find out more about the work that you put out?
I'm on X under my name, James B. Meigs, and the bulk of my work is with the Manhattan Institute and their really great journal, City Journal, which is a wonderful place to read about what's going on in New York City and the state, and really sort of a hard-headed look at how we can achieve good policy outcomes without disrupting markets and disrupting people's lives.
Okay. Jim, thanks so much for being on New York Insider.
It's my pleasure.